So, hello, and welcome back yet again to Christine's Crazy Recaps. One of these days, I might actually think of some good way to term what I'm doing here, but sure, Christine's Crazy Recaps. Anyway, we are back in seeing what is going on in the Phoenix Endangered, where in the last couple of chapters, the Isvani army, which was not meant to be an army when Bitso Chim sent it away, uh, seems to be attacking the Atreyu cities. That can't be good. Harrier and Tercel heard news first that all of the Isvani had disappeared and that they wouldn't be able to find guides, which meant that they kind of sort of wouldn't be able to go searching for the Lake of Fire because according to the Telchi, you can't really get around in the desert without Isvani tribe members as guides because they're the only people that know how to survive out there. And they all seem to have disappeared, which we know is because Biso Chim has gathered them all up. And then at the end of the chapter, while Harrier was busy training and Tercel was busy trying to figure out what their next steps should be, right about as they decided that, okay, they would just go to the closest oasis and call in Ankeldar, and Tercel could search and Harrier could keep training so that he could protect Tercel when the time came. But right as they had pretty much made up their minds to do that, some people started flooding into the city saying that there was an army of Isvani desert tribe members who were attacking and ransacking and looting the other Atreyu cities, and that they were headed right towards Harrier and Tercel. This caused panic in the city, and the boys had to make up their minds pretty quickly if they were going to stay and help defend or if they were going to go on with what they needed to be doing as far as, stopping the darkness from returning. And they decided to stay, and that is where we left them, getting ready for possibly a giant attack on the city. Other than that, in my own personal life, I figured I would update you because I'm thrilled beyond measure. If you remember, what was it? Right towards, I think, the beginning of spring, my washing machine died. And ever since then, I have been prevailing upon my wonderful neighbor and using his washing machine. And that has worked out really well. And I've been keeping my eyes open whenever I go into any of the restores or resale places or anything to see if I can find a good old used one, because I don't like new washing machines nearly as much. I want just a nice old-fashioned top load, basic, simple, no bells, no whistles. Well, last week I found one, and today it is now in its place of honor and has done a load of laundry, and I am thrilled. It's a apartment size Speed Queen washer, fantastic, and it only cost me $50 and a dinner for my neighbor. So I think it's absolutely wonderful, and that made me happy. So that is my Christine's personal note. The clothes are out on the line right now, so I just had to take them from my house to my line, and that made me very happy. I really appreciate my neighbor for letting me use his washing machine for these last few months, but I'm sure in the winter that would have been not nearly as nice. So I'm really glad to have a washing machine again. Anyway, enough of all that though. Let's jump in, and we're going to do another 2 chapters tonight, beginning with my recap of Chapter 12 of The Phoenix Endangered by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. Chapter 12 is titled The Gathering storm. Now, as we begin chapter 12, the city is actually fairly calm. There's an initial exodus of people who are panicking and leaving, and everybody else stays, and everything is fairly calm. The Telchi and surprisingly Harrier are training up a new city militia, and Tercel has been put to work as a basically clerk because they found out he could read and write. The one thing that they are not telling anybody in the city other than the Telchi is that Tercel is a high mage and Harrier is actually a night mage. They're not telling them, and that's mostly because, well, I'll just quote from the book. Me being a high mage? No, better off not to tell. And probably just as well that you didn't let him tell anyone that you were a wild mage when we came into the city, because then everybody would be expecting you to do something. Harrier sighed. Be nice to know what. Considering that apparently there are dozens of wild mages down in this area for every square foot of sand, and they didn't do anything. But they all disappeared, Tercel said. I hope that worries you, Harrier told him. A lot, Tercel assured him. But I don't know what I can do about it. Find them? Harrier suggested. Tercel explains to Harrier that there just doesn't seem to be that sort of a spell in high magic, at least not one that he's ever found. There are spells that let you see people you already know, but you have to already know them. And he thinks about how the high magic is a bit confusing. He does point out to Harrier that the wild magic doesn't seem to have that sort of a constraint, and he could just scry since it doesn't seem to have a mage price. Harrier, still being Harrier, is quite reluctant to do a spell, but eventually he does. He goes ahead and he does the scrying spell, and he shoos Tercel out of the room since using wild magic makes Tercel feel ill. And then Tercel comes back later on. It was dusk by the time Harrier came out. He'd looked shocked and tired and sick, and he had refused to tell Tercel what he had seen, only that it wasn't anything that would do them any good. Tercel did not ask Harrier to do magic again. They talk a little bit more about the training that Harrier and the Telchi are doing to ready up a city militia. About half of the city is convinced that this Darkspawn army, which is what they're calling it, that is supposedly coming for them, probably isn't going to come. The other half of the city thinks that, you know what, they'll have lots of warning. Evidently, this army was huge. Tercel, the Telchi, and the council decide they don't like either of those options, so they send out scouts. Unfortunately, the scouts haven't reported back in. It's now been a couple of sun nights, and still no Darkspawn army has come out, which is good. And it's kind of making Harrier edgy. Harrier asks Tercel, we both know when this Isvani army shows up, it's going to be up to you and Ankildar. What are you planning on doing? Tercel is like, what on earth do you want me to do about it? Quoting again. Harrier smiled. You. Please don't tell me I'm a night mage. I know it. He closed his eyes as if he were remembering things he wished he had never seen. I can tell you the walls won't hold. I can tell you they can be scaled inside and out. I can tell you how to take the walls down, and I guess maybe I could do a fair job of defending this place for a while, if anybody would listen to me. They won't, though. I'm not Kellen the poor orphan boy, and I don't have an army or a magic sword, and since this is not the time to expect me to start figuring out how to cast major wild magic spells, just leaving aside that to do that I'd have to get a bunch of people to lend power to any big spells, which would then mean me telling them that I'm a wild mage, which could get ugly. Well, barring all of that, it's up to you. Tercel is very reluctant because he still remembers, even though he wishes that he had gotten there sooner and been able to do something, he still remembers the way the goblins that he burned screamed. And he's like, I can't hurt anybody. I just can't. And they're sort of at a stalemate. Tercel says that maybe when the army gets there, maybe he'll be able to just, scare them off. And that seems to be as good as he gets as far as a plan. Harrier laughs and says, you could just call Ankeldar. I bet if the army shows up and Ankeldar is sitting on the wall, it'd make them think twice. And Tercel points out that that probably wouldn't work because Ankeldar would probably also scare all of the citizens that they were trying to protect half to death. More time passes. It's about another week that goes by. There are more people that are leaving the city, heading north, which is probably a good idea. Good plan on their part. I think I would probably want to too. But a lot of other people are like, you know what? Nothing has shown up yet. I'm sure everything's going to be fine. And besides, we've got really high, thick, strong walls. And yeah, everything will be absolutely better. Tercel realizes during this time that it's now been a year since they left home. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between this trilogy and the last one. The last three books, despite everything that happens in them, all take place in the span of, well, essentially a year and a day, because that's how long Kellen and Shulkin's Mage Price ran. And it seemed like, reading the Obsidian trilogy, that it had to have been years and years and years. But no, it wasn't. And this one, it almost feels the opposite. Like, you keep hearing that time is going by, but reading that it had been an entire year since the boys left home in the book and a half that we've gone through kind of shocked me. Harrier continues to try to convince Tercel to wake up Ankeldar and bring him, at least close by, at least in case, he's needed. Tercel continues to resist because he just doesn't think that it would be entirely safe for Ankeldar. They go and they consult Telchi because they are at a stalemate with their argument, and the Telchi tells them, I don't actually think having Ankeldar here would be useful. If I thought that it would be useful to let them know that you are both mages, I would let the council know that. But, yeah, there would probably not actually, it wouldn't be a good thing. And mostly he thinks it wouldn't be a good thing because then the council and anybody else that knew that they were mages would either blame them for not doing enough or ask them things that they can't do. The boys finally agree, and, they try to get a little bit of rest. They're pretty much thinking that They've got at least another fortnight to get lots of people to leave the city and try and figure out their defenses, but turns out they didn't. They are awoken in the middle of the night, and it's mostly because of the flock guards, because the people of the city send their flocks out to graze at night in the cooler weather. And the flock guards start making noise because the Isvani are here. They're standing at the walls, and Harrier and Tercel go out to see this darkspawn army. The Telchi, who is also with them, says it's quite odd because it's quite the large group, and they arrive pretty much silently, and they are standing outside of the walls, and the Telchi says, I see a Dante Isvani, and Lazander, and Fiderama, and Haturi, and Kadastar all here together. Yet the tribes do not band together for any reason, and many of these tribes do not ever approach the cities at all. Harrier, on the other hand, looking out at this army, realizes that there is no way that they can hold the city. Like, not at all. And Tercel, on his part, thinks, I just need to go talk to them. Harrier thinks that he's kind of insane, but he goes with him. He isn't sure how they're going to persuade the gate guards to let them out to supposedly go talk to this army, but Harrier, thankfully, has gotten to know lots of the city guard, and they actually let the boys out, thinking that they're probably just going to run. They approach the Isvani army, which don't attack them. Tercel takes this as a good sign, and they get close to what seems to be the leader of all of these tribesmen, quoting, "We want to talk," Tercel said quickly, before the other man could say anything. "My name is Tercel Rolford, and I'm from Arameth. It's a city in the north. I want to know what you want." The leader of the army stared at Tercel for a long moment. A Shotar was a good bit taller than a horse, so he was looking down on him. Harrier had an urge to reach for his sword. The man was armed, and so were the men on both sides of him. Harrier wasn't sure how quickly Tercel could cast a spell, but he wasn't sure it would be fast enough to keep him from getting killed. Once, Golden Arameth was the last defense against the darkness, the man said slowly. I, Xanatar of the Lazandar Isvani, say this. Now Arameth is a crucible of error and taint, just as the Atreyu cities are. Its day for cleansing will come too. Tercel argues, and going on, Xanatar says, You follow the false balance. Since the time of the great flowering, the balance of the world has been out of true, for the light destroyed the great evil that beset the world in that time, as was only right. But those who kept the light in those days did not stop where they should have, and so ever since that day, the great balance has been tipping more and more away from what the wild magic means it to be. Generation after generation has followed this false balance, upholding it for their own purposes. They have taught the light is always good. But the children of the desert know better. Light scours, light blinds, light kills. It is darkness that is the friend and ally of the desert born, and the true balance contains both dark and light. This is the balance, as it was kept in ancient times, the balance that we will restore to the land. Harrier thinks that this is the dumbest thing he's ever heard. He knows that you don't actually need to even be a wild mage to know that this is absolutely crazy talk. Tercel tries to argue, And he says, no, the light sent me here. Xanatar, you have to listen to me. But as soon as Tercel mentions that the light is what sent him, Xanatar begins reaching for his sword. Harrier jumps for Tercel to get him out of the way, and Tercel raised his hands, and a wall of purple light appeared between him and the Isvani army. It's a good thing that Harrier didn't draw his swords, because the sudden appearance of this glowy wall made his horse and Tercel's start rearing and bucking, and it takes them a few minutes to calm down the animals. They can also hear on the other side of this wall of purple light that the Isvani army is also kind of freaking out. But finally, Harrier gets his mount and Tercel's under control, and, quoting, when he finally did, he looked up to see that the wall of Mage Shield extended as far as he could see. He looked up. It went as high as he could see as well, arcing over the city. Tercel, he said. The light sent me here because there's darkness somewhere out there in the desert, Tercel said quietly. After a moment, Harrier realized he was finishing what he was saying to Xanatar. You cast Mage Shield around the city, Harrier said. I had to, Tercel told him. Anything less, and they would have just come around it. Harrier realizes that he can see a little bit through the wall of mage light, and they had retreated, but they were spreading out in front of the wall of Mage Shield in a very ominous mass. He also realizes that Mage Shield doesn't block sound, and he could hear the army shouting, and he figures, Tercel, we probably need to get back in the city. If they can get back in the city. Harrier realizes that they might have just blown their "we are just northern boys down here in the desert for no good reason" really out the window, because, well, obviously magic just happened. The people of the city are probably going to be freaking out as well. Tercel is more concerned about who told this guy that balance is out of true. Harrier is like, maybe he was talking to that fire lady that you've been dreaming about. Do you actually think it matters? Tercel, being Tercel, would still like to know, but he's not going to find out for at least a while. And they approach the city gates, and Harrier realizes one more thing. Harrier realizes that Tercel actually has to hold the Mage Shield or it's going to fail. And he says, quoting, "How long can you hold that shield in place anyway?" "As long as I have to," Tercel said. Harrier deliberately didn't look at his friend as the words struck through him. When he had asked the question, he had only been thinking of the Isvani and how long it might take them to give up and leave, but now Harrier realized they had a greater problem. What if they didn't leave? Tercel drew on Ankildar's power to cast his spell, and Ankildar's power was as close to infinite as made no difference. There was not a way for Tercel to use it up, but Tercel could use himself up. Harrier listened to him talk about the high magic for long enough to know that there were pretty much two types of spells. One kind you cast, and they were over and done with, like fire or mage light. The other kind needed to be held in place by the will of the mage, like Mage Shield. Ankildar's power was infinite, but Tercell's endurance wasn't. And with that, that is where the chapter ends with they kind of have a couple of problems. Their first problem is, will the gate guards let them back into the city? And obviously the second problem is the much bigger one, and that is, how long can Tercell actually hold Mage Shield in place before he has to release it, and then they're going to be right back at square one with a probably very, very angry Isvani army, now even more determined to get through, and probably even more determined to hunt down Tercell at least and get rid of him. So that is where that chapter ends. The next chapter, which we will be going to in just a minute, is chapter 13, and we're going to see the other side of the coin and what is going on in this Isvani army, and actually why they turned into an army. But first, I'm going to grab a drink. All right, so chapter 13 is titled The Wind That Shakes the Stars. And chapter 13, we actually go back in time a little bit because we are now joining up with Xanatar and learning a little bit about his rationale. He had never actually meant to be a leader of an army. He was just the leader of the little band that set out when Bisochim sent them to hunt for the Nalzindar. He hunts along with his little band, and they don't find anything. It seemed like when they were out there as if there were no trace anywhere. It also is obvious that there have been fierce sand winds recently, and they search and search and search, and they're not finding anything. In fact, at the end of a fortnight, the group that he is in is talking about probably just going back to the paradise that Bisochim has made them, even though they don't really want to. They can't find the Nalzindar. Xanatar thinks that maybe Sharia took her people to one of the Atreyu cities, or maybe somewhere else. But, they finally agree that they're just going to go back, hanging their heads with their tails between their legs. They start to head back to the great oasis that Bisochim has made for them. And they're trudging right along when one of the trackers in their group notices something out of place. She notices a sand dune that seems to be too big and too regular, and anything that's out of place is definitely something that should be investigated. So they go and they begin to dig in the sand dune, and they find skeletons. First, they uncover the skeleton of a Shotar, and they realize it's saddled. Not what you normally find, since most of the desert dwellers get out of the way of a sand wind, but, not totally unheard of. They dig a little bit deeper, and they find that the Shotar had a rider. And as they dig a little more, the rider's terrible secret is exposed. The skeletons of 3 Shotars, their bones scoured in the fashion familiar to all who had ever faced the Sandwind's fury. The terrible desert wind did not stop with killing. If it went on long enough, it flensed flesh from bones and left them polished as cleanly as if they had lain in the desert for many seasons. The remnants of the saddle still was clinging to one of the Shotars, and scraps of the light woolen pack saddles lay tangled with the bones of the other. And beneath the bodies of the Shotars was their owner. The body beneath the shotars was as skeletal as they were, but it had been sheltered enough so that some scraps of its clothing still clung to the scoured bones. They were blue. Xanatar takes this as a sign that the wild mage was killed and that it was probably the false balance that did it. He thinks that it's proof because obviously only magic could kill another magic user. And this is, in his mind anyway, all the proof that they need to maybe show this skeleton, maybe show this terrible relic to the other scattered hunters that were looking for the Nalzindar, and obviously go and band together, form an army. And the only thing that he could think of that would have magic users would be the Atreyu cities. He's asked what his plans are, and he says, quoting, "The soft dwellers in the Atreyu cities have forgotten the lessons of the Izvai, if they ever knew them," Xanatar said. His teeth flashed white in his beard as he smiled a terrible smile. "The desert does not belong to them. It belongs to us, and we shall reclaim it in Bisochim's name, and we will cleanse it in the name of the true balance." So with this one little wild mage skeleton, an army is born. Xanatar and his little group start sending out messages to all of the other groups, and they all gather at one of the oases, and they decide that Xanatar's right, that definitely this must be a sign that the wild mages were killed by probably magic coming from the Atreyu cities, and that we definitely need to scour the cities. A few people oppose his plan, and he tells them that go back to Bisochim, that's fine. I won't keep any of you here if you want to go, but surely a wild mage who commands a dragon must already know what we're planning. The wild magic has always sent the blue robes where they are most needed by the Izvani, for they have the art of seeing and knowing at a distance. Yet has Bisochim come amongst us to turn us from our course? And so with that, this bunch of warriors that Bisochim just was trying to keep occupied and stop from fighting turns into an army. And this army's purpose now is the Atreyu cities. Their first stop is Ornisai Atreyu, which is one of the string of pearl cities that form a ragged crescent around the north and the east of Mandirian. And they pull up to the town, and the first city is very, very easy. They ride up, ask for the gates to be opened, the gates are opened, and the army pours in. And they slaughter everyone in the city. It's in Xanatar's mind that if they don't kill everybody, well then, that would be like leaving a scorpion's nest full of eggs to hatch later. So they literally slaughter everyone in the city, which is a brutal read. And then as they leave, well, when they had taken everything useful from Ornisai Atreyu, there were 2 tasks remaining. In the desert, water was a sacred thing. A man might meet his greatest enemy at an oasis and would not keep him from drinking, nor slay him within the bounds of the oasis. And though there was no charity among the desert folk, no gift of shelter or food or clothing, water was freely given, even to a stranger, even to an enemy. But Xanatar changes all of that. He argues with his people a little bit because this is custom, almost law amongst their people, that water is never despoiled, but in the end, his counsel was followed. The army drank deep from the Atreyu in Ornisal Atreyu, and then they levered the great cover stone off of the cistern, and they packed the well with the rotting bodies. When that was done, they set fire to all that remained. Much of the city was cloth and dry wood. It burned well. So after they have literally razed the first city to the ground, they move on. The next city, the people were a little more prudent. They saw thousands and thousands of people outside of their gates and said, no, we're not opening these gates to you. Much smarter group. But it doesn't really save them. They wait outside of the city, the army, and every time they see somebody pop up on the wall, they just shoot them. After a little while, they go all the way around the city where the flocks were out grazing, and they kill all of the flocks and roast them. And then they find the orchards and they strip all of the trees, and then they cut all the trees down, pile them up against the city walls, and light them on fire. Xanatar's not completely silly, though. He doesn't light all four walls of the city on fire. No, he lights 3 walls on fire and leaves one suspiciously empty and open. And when those gates open and the people inside the city open the gates to flee, Xanatar's army kills everyone. They repeat what they did in the first city. They kill everybody and burn the city and spoil the well. The next city is actually a little bit farther, and this is where Xanatar starts running into a little bit of difficulty. And that is mostly that in the desert, never before have so many people all been traveling together. It's stripping their resources almost dry, and they make it to the next city hungry and very thirsty. So they know they have to take the city fast. They take it as fast as they can, but since they've been dealing with a little bit more privation, a few survivors escape. And this is where they start really running into difficulty, because those survivors head towards the next city, which is their next target. It still falls, and their next target is the city that warned Harrier and everyone in Tarnatha Atreyu. But Xanatar's people do make it out. Obviously, they completely burn, what is the name of this Atreyu? I can't remember. Laganda Atreyu. He destroys Laganda Atreyu, and they are going to just keep on keeping on, just step by step. There are 9 of these cities in the south, and they've managed to now destroy like 5 of them. And then they get to Tarnatha Atreyu, and he feels like maybe they're being tested, and now he definitely knows that they're being tested. I'm going to read the last few paragraphs of this chapter. When they reached the gates of Tarnatha Atreyu, Xanatar knew that he had been right to fear the wild magic's harsh testing. They approached by night, and in stealth, but the guard dogs alerted the city, and warning beacons were lit, and the wall was ringed with torches. His people were weary with the long journey here, and there had been little food and less water on the long days of the journey. They must take the city, and take it soon if they were to survive. It was for this reason that when the two children, bold and unafraid, rode out to face his army, Xanatar did not slay them immediately. Such foolishness, such madness must be another sign, and he wanted to interpret it before acting. One boy had hair the color of a newborn Shotar's coat and eyes the color of the desert sky. The other had hair the color of embers and bore twin swords upon his back and gazed at Xanatar as if he wished him to die. Yet it was the sky-eyed one who spoke, offering bold words of question and challenge, and Xanatar answered him fairly, even though he had said plainly he served the false balance. Xanatar wondered if this was what all of the testing and ordeals that he and his people had been sent by the wild magic had been for. If maybe Xanatar had been given the power through his passion and his sacrifice to convince those who followed the false balance to turn from their error. For surely, if Xanatar could turn strangers from Arameth itself towards the true balance, then maybe it would be time to follow a new way, the way of words and persuasion. Xanatar spoke long and carefully, bringing forth all of the words that he kept in his heart, all the words he had heard Bisochim say, all the words that Xanatar knew to be true and good. And the child rejected them all. Xanatar knew then that they must be the first to die as a sign to all that remained in the city. Perhaps this was why they had been sent forth. So the people of Tarnatha Atreyu, seeing them die, would allow their own deaths to be quick. He reached for his awarden, and suddenly a wall of light, bright and shocking, appeared between him and the children. He shouted in surprise at the unnatural thing, and his Shotar bawled in terror, and all around him the people were cast into confusion and terror. By the time he could force his beast to kneel and return to the purple light, the city was gone. All that remained was the light, covering it like a great upturned bowl. He drew his awarden, and he struck it, but the steel only rang off the light as though striking stone. And then Xanatar knew the true reason why they had been tested so long and so hard, and given so many chances to turn aside. Their great enemy had already returned to the Mandarian desert. He had come in the form of children. Did not all the ancient story songs teach that the Endarkin could take on as many forms that were fair and pleasing? The story songs also taught that the power of darkness was weak at first, requiring allies and sacrifices. The children must have come seeking both. But if his people were strong enough, and strong in their devotion to the wild magic, then they could yet prevail, and their victory would be for the true balance, here and now. And that is where the chapter ends, with Xanatar being another antagonist that he's doing terrible things. He and his army are doing absolutely terrible, reprehensible things, but he thinks he's doing it for the greater good. Again, it's a very complicated antagonist, and I kind of like that. Like I said the last time, I do like sometimes a very clear-cut enemy and a very clear-cut good guy. But I also really like all of these tangled up bad guys and good guys. Like, obviously, the woman in the lake of fire, the spirit of darkness, or whatever she is evil. You know, straight up black, evil, bad, no good. Then you have Bisachim, who is being lied to and is lying to himself, but doing it out of love. And then you have this third step down, which is all of the Isvani that he's lying to that are now doing terrible things third hand. It makes a very messy, complicated thing, and it makes for a good story, which, as always, if you can find these books, I 1,000% recommend getting them and reading them, because I'm having fun doing these recaps, but it's not the same as actually reading them. I do highly suggest it if you can find the books. But if you can't, hopefully I'm at least communicating the gist of each chapter. Anyway, that is where I am going to leave it though tonight. Thank you so much for joining me for another unhinged recapping of The Phoenix Endangered. Wonderful book, and I will see you next time.